welcome to History House. I'm your host, Owen Delaney. Let's begin. Today, we are turning away from the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East, and we'll be discussing Ireland, just before and after its War of Independence, through the lens of Lady Hazel Lavery. An often understudied figure, she played a key role in hosting discussions between Irish and British officials that led to the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922, and was also the wife of a leading painter, Sir John Lavery, but also an accomplished artist in her own right, as well as being a prominent socialite in London and Dublin from the 1910s to the 1930s. She was friendly with the leading individuals of British and Irish society, from Winston Churchill, the most recognisable British politician of the 20th century, to the figure most often associated with Ireland's struggle for independence, Michael Collins, and other personalities who led Ireland in the years after 1921. For many people, however, she is most often remembered as the model that appeared on the original Irish Banknotes from 1928 to 1977, and as their watermark until Ireland adopted the euro as its currency in 2002. While the last point is an important legacy in its own right, there is clearly more to Lady Lavery than being the literal representation of Ireland in the years after British rule, and her other achievements and her personal life deserve to be highlighted more. This episode aims to do this, and to place the spotlight on a woman who played a crucial role in championing Irish independence and shaping the Irish state from 1921, just as much as some of the celebrated Irish revolutionaries of the time, who in the popular memory are remembered primarily as men. So who was Lady Lavery? Hazel Martin was born Elsa Martin on the 14th of March 1880, not in Dublin or London, but rather 514 North Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, in the United States of America. Her parents, who changed her name to Hazel on account of her large brown eyes, were Edward Jenner Martin and Alice Louise Taggart, the daughter of New Yorkers who owned a successful hardware business, and she also had a younger sister, Dorothea, commonly known as Dorothy, who was born in 1887 and died in 1911 at the age of 23. Edward, originally from Massachusetts, was a prominent figure in Armour & Co., the largest meat company in Chicago for a time, and was also the vice president and director of the Union Stockyard and Transit Company of Chicago. Needless to say, he was a prominent businessman in Chicago from the late 1880s into the 1890s, and as Sinead McCool states in her biography of Hazel, wherever anything went wrong, Martin was always the man to look after it. Most importantly, for her later interest in Irish affairs, Edward Martin was descended from the Martins of Galway, who had arrived in Ireland following the Norman invasion of the island, which began in 1169, and her fascination with the world beyond Chicago would be strengthened in 1893 when the city hosted the World's Exposition, bringing together art from Europe, which would undoubtedly inspire her future career. After being educated first by her mother, Hazel attended various schools. In 1896, she was accepted at Miss Masters, a boarding school located just to the north of New York City, where she excelled at acting. Despite the shock that came with her father's death in 1897, Hazel graduated Miss Masters the following year before travelling to France. It was here that she would encounter the works of Manet, Monet, Cézanne and Van Gogh, further inspiring her artistic career, and by 1903, that same year, she married Edward Livingston Trudeau Jr., the son of Edward Livingston Trudeau Sr., a prominent physician known for his work on treating tuberculosis. Hazel had first met Edward Livingston Trudeau Jr. at a dance arranged between Yale University and Miss Masters, and her family were supportive of the match. Hazel, however, was in love with someone else. John Lavery, Sir from 1918, was born in Belfast in 1856 and would grow up in Moira in County Antrim, now in Northern Ireland, and Ayrshire in the southwest of Scotland. After working in a photographer studio in Glasgow, Lavery became a painter training first in London and Paris, but his career would take off after being commissioned to paint Queen Victoria's visit to Glasgow in 1888. He would frequent an artist colony in Brittany until in 1903, during one of his visits, he was asked to paint an American sitter, Hazel Martin. Hazel, by the third day of knowing him, professed her love to the Irish artist in the village of Pont-Aven. John's previous wife had died in 1891, and aware of the age gap between them, over 20 years, at first resisted, but eventually his feelings for her grew. In spite of this, Hazel's mother Alice was against the relationship, not least from the short space of time by which they knew each other. The fact that the Martins were Episcopalian, a Protestant denomination that is part of the Anglican community, whereas Lavery was Catholic, could also have played a part in Alice's opposition. She clearly favoured Trudeau, whom Hazel had known for a number of years and who was a perfect society match for the US of the 1900s, owing to his father's standing as a prominent physician. Hazel eventually relented and married Trudeau on the 28th of December 1903 in Chicago. Her feelings, however, were clearly directed towards John. The day of her wedding, Hazel wrote the following to Lavery. Dearest, I wish my heart had stopped beating forever that night at Pont-Aven. I remember how I trembled all the night through and prayed God to let me be happy and have my heart's desire. I knew then that I was to suffer. I never dreamed how much. I love you supremely. I am not an ordinary woman, and I do not love in an ordinary way. This marriage, however, was brief. Trudeau would die from complications after contracting pneumonia about 5 months after their wedding, and Hazel would give birth to a daughter, Alice, in October 1904, nearly succumbing herself to nephritis. After recovering sufficiently, she resumed contact with John, although as ever Hazel's mother was opposed to the match. While staying in Paris in 1905, a doctor in Rome was recommended to Hazel to continue her recovery, and while there she met Leonard Moorhead Thomas, the second secretary at the US Embassy in the city. In spite of her frequent letters to Lavery, Hazel appears to have fallen for Thomas, and soon there were plans for them to marry, only for him to jilt Hazel just before the wedding. Correspondence was to continue between Lavery and Martin, with John forgiving Hazel's actions, though their letters were not as frequent as before. Finally, on the 20th of June 1909, Hazel's mother, Alice Martin, died from appendicitis, and on the 22nd of July, Hazel Martin, afterwards Hazel Lavery, married John Lavery, this time in a Catholic ceremony at Brompton Oratory in London. She herself would convert to Catholicism in 1914. Hazel's marriage to John would last for nearly 26 years, the rest of her life. The couple would reside at 5 Cromwell Place in Kensington in the west of London, although they would often frequent Tangier in Morocco and have a holiday home at a place called Dar el Midfa, the House of the Canon. Their status in London society grew, enhanced by John's status as a society painter, painting the most well-known politicians on both sides of the Irish Sea. This included not only Winston Churchill and H. Asquith, the British Prime Minister from 1908 to 1916, but also the prominent Irish politician Sir John Redmond, who wanted Home Rule for Ireland, an Irish Parliament in Dublin while remaining part of the British Empire, as well as Sir Edward Carson, the most prominent Unionist politician of his time, who wanted direct rule from Westminster to continue. When World War I broke out in 1914, John Lavery was appointed as an official war artist, and in recognition for his services, he was knighted in 1918, becoming Sir John Lavery, and Hazel becoming Lady Lavery. In the midst of all this, Hazel was becoming more and more interested in Irish politics. Her ancestry, no doubt, played a role in this, as did her marriage to an Irish Catholic, and they appeared to be supporters of Home Rule in the vision of Sir John Redmond. Indeed, Asquith, the Prime Minister, would call Hazel, quote, the Queen of Ireland, in a condescending and derogatory manner. However, the dominance of constitutional nationalism would shift in favour of republicanism, a completely independent Irish Republic, following the Easter Rising of 1916. While public opinion was against the rebellion initially, owing to the destruction of much of Dublin, attitudes shifted following the execution of the rebel leaders, allowing them to become martyrs in the public consciousness. Perhaps the most well-known of the rebellion's ringleaders was Sir Roger Casement, a prominent human rights activist who had been knighted by the British monarch for exposing colonial abuses of indigenous people in the Belgian Congo and Peru. Unlike the other leaders who had been executed in Dublin after a brief trial under the guise of the British military, Casement was afforded a trial in the Central Criminal Court, in which both Hazel and John attended. John would discreetly paint the trial, and if you look closely, the figure of Mrs. Lavery can be made out in the public gallery. Casement himself was found guilty and hanged on the 3rd of August 1916, but it appeared that in its place, the fires of Hazel's passion for Irish independence would only burn brighter. In 1920, while on a visit to Ireland, a letter was written by John and signed by the couple, which was sent to Winston Churchill, who was at the time the Minister of War, as well as being a friend to both of them. This letter stated rather directly that, quote, "I believe that Ireland will never be governed by Westminster, the Vatican or Ulster without continuous bloodshed. I also believe that the removal of the castle, Dublin Castle, the seat of British rule in Ireland, and all its works, leaving Irishmen to settle their own affairs, is the only solution left." End quote. By 1921, both the Irish Republican and British forces were exhausted after a protracted guerrilla war. The Irish were suffering from low ammunition and morale, and would have found it increasingly difficult to continue fighting indefinitely. The British authorities, by contrast, were facing a public backlash following reports of continued fighting, the deaths of prominent figures, as well as atrocities. These included the death of Terence McSweeney, the Lord Mayor of Cork, who died while on hunger strike in Brixton Prison in London, the killing of civilians at a Gaelic football match, Bloody Sunday, and the burning of Cork by British securities, just to name a few. These stories found their way not just into the British and Irish press, but also the international media, affecting Britain's standing globally and hampering their ability to crack down on the Irish independence movement. In light of all this, a truce was agreed between both parties on the 11th of July 1921, with talks to follow which would lay out the future relationship between Ireland and Britain. In no small part, it would be the Laverys, both Hazel and John, who will play a key role in these negotiations from their residence in Kensington, London. Before we talk about Lady Lavery's involvement in the Anglo-Irish negotiations, we'll park it here and take a short break. See you all soon. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Lady Hazel Lavery, her early life, marriage to Sir John Lavery, and her interest in Irish politics. Now, we will be discussing the Laverys' role in the Anglo-Irish negotiations of 1921, the nature of her relationships with two leading Irish political figures, Michael Collins and Kevin O'Higgins, as well as examining how she became the new face of Ireland through its banknotes, when the Irish Free State issued them for the first time in 1928. After the Truce of 1921, discussions followed as to how the negotiations between Irish and British representatives would proceed. After some talks, it was agreed that the negotiations were to take place in London, with an Irish negotiating team consisting of 5 negotiators: their chairman, Arthur Griffith, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs; Michael Collins, the Secretary of State for Finance; Robert Barton, the Secretary of State for Economic Affairs; and the TDs, members of the Irish Parliament, Dáil Éireann, Eamon Duggan and George Gavan Duffy. Curiously, the President of the Irish Republic, Eamon de Valera, refused to lead the negotiations, leading to animosity when he refused to accept the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which in turn led to the Irish Civil War of 1922 to 1923. The British delegation would consist of 7 individuals, the leading British political figures of the day, who were evidently more superior in negotiating than their Irish counterparts: David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister; Lord Birkenhead, the Lord Chancellor; Austen Chamberlain, the Leader of the House of Commons; Winston Churchill, the Secretary of State for the Colonies; Sir Lamon Worthington Evans, the Secretary of State for War; Sir Gordon Hewart, the British Attorney General; and Sir Hamar Greenwood, the Chief Secretary for Ireland. Neither delegation had any women. While the official negotiations would take place in formal settings, it was the Laverys' residence at 5 Cromwell Place in Kensington that would prove to be an important venue for informal discussions. Their relations with the upper echelons of British society, such as with Churchill, but others too from Sir John's status as a painter, enabled them to have a friendly impression from the perspective of the British delegation, while their, particularly Hazel's, commitment to Irish nationalism also enabled them to be perceived as allies by the Irish side. Sir John Lavery was commissioned to paint official portraits of the British-Irish delegations, and through these initial contacts, the Laverys were able to act as informal mediators to both sides in the negotiations. In mid-November 1921, Collins sat for his official portrait, sitting at the Lavery residence, a process that he wrote as, quote, absolute torture, but through this meeting he had been introduced to the couple, and in particular to Hazel. She had long wanted to meet him, not least because of his reputation. Michael Collins, while officially acting as the Irish Republic's principal figure for finance, and undoubtedly was key in securing funding for Ireland's War of Independence, also played a decisive role in the military aspect of this war. His position as president of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, a secret organisation that was committed to Irish independence through military means, enabled him to play a key role in directing Ireland's guerrilla war against Britain, even if it was officially the responsibility of Cathal Brugha, the Irish Minister for Defence. While under his position as the Irish Republican Army's Director of Intelligence, Collins was able to create a network of Irish informants embedded with British officials. As such, Collins was seen by some as the real military figure responsible for directing Ireland's War of Independence. As the official negotiations were taking place, the Irish delegation would dine a number of times at the Lavery residence, with Lord Birkenhead, a member of the British team, attending these receptions on a number of occasions. It was at these occasions that Collins formed an unexpected friendship with Birkenhead, which is believed by some to have helped make an agreement with both sides possible. At the same time, a closeness developed between Hazel and Michael Collins. The two, outside of dinner at the Lavery's residence, would often meet at morning Catholic Mass at Brompton Oratory, and Collins gifted her with a Kerry Blue Terrier who she named Mick, Collins's nickname. Indeed, when the final terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty were proposed, Hazel allegedly persuaded Collins to sign and accompanied him to Downing Street. On the 6th of December 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, which would create a self-governing British Dominion, the Irish Free State, with members of the Irish Parliament required to declare an oath of allegiance to the British monarch, and a boundary commission was created to delineate the border between Northern Ireland and this new Irish state. While passing it was relatively easy on the British side, with the British House of Commons and House of Lords passing it by clear majorities, the Irish Parliament, Dáil Éireann, only passed it by 64 votes to 57, leading to a split between those who accepted the treaty and those who wished to continue the fight against Britain in order to secure a full Irish Republic. After building up of tensions, the Irish Civil War began on the 20th of June 1922 when pro-treaty forces attacked anti-treaty forces at the Four Courts in Dublin, with the pro-treaty forces being led by Collins through his position as the Commander-in-Chief of the Irish National Army. Throughout this time, Collins continued his correspondence with Lady Lavery, along with making frequent visits to London, attending dinners at the Laverys' residence. While he was engaged to Kitty Kiernan, he was increasingly seen with Hazel, possibly owing to her political insight rather than a romantic connection, although it is impossible to prove or disprove this. Naturally, Kitty was increasingly jealous of her and Collins himself would also write poetry for Hazel, including one called, quote, Hazel Darling. There are also anecdotes about Collins wanting to run off to America with her, abandoning his military duties, but this remains just a story. What we do know is that by August they were, in the words of Sinead McCool, quote, inseparable, especially in the middle of the month when the Laverys were staying in Dublin. On the 22nd of August, Michael Collins was killed at an ambush at Ballinavlaw in County Cork, with a letter from Hazel supposedly found on his body. While his remains were brought to Dublin, Hazel insisted on wearing widow wreaths, but owing to his engagement to Kiernan, Hazel was made to leave the mortuary chapel at St. Vincent's Hospital in order to avoid a scene. Whatever the nature of their relationship, Hazel was deeply affected by the death of Collins, as was her husband. Sir John Lavery clearly viewed him as a friend, and Lavery would paint a portrait of Collins draped in the Irish flag, his eyes shut, appearing almost like he was asleep. This work is called Michael Collins, Love of Ireland, and is included in the social media links to this episode. Hazel would maintain a relationship with Collins' sister, Hanny, for the rest of their lives, and she returned all the objects connected to Hazel that Collins had when he died. These included a lock of Hazel's hair, along with a short letter to her from Collins, which reads as follows, quote, Hazel dearest, Hazel, my dear, dear Hazel, I too wish it was tomorrow. With all my love, yours, M. In the months following Collins' assassination, Hazel would support the implementation of the Anglo-Irish Treaty and keep in contact with the government ministers of this new Irish state. Around this time, Lady Lavery had begun an extensive correspondence with Kevin O'Higgins, the Vice President of the Executive Council, essentially the Deputy Prime Minister, or Taoiseach, and Minister for Justice of the Irish Free State. They had first met during the treaty negotiations in London, and during his visits in the city from 1923 to 1927, he would frequently stay at the Laverys' residence, with the Laverys doing the opposite in 1923. The letters that the two exchanged first came to wide attention in Sinead McCool's biography of Hazel Lavery, and from initial examination they do suggest a deep relationship. In November 1924, O'Higgins wrote that Hazel was the, quote, sweetest and most wonderful influence in his life. It should be noted that he had been married to a woman called Bridget Cole since 1921. In late 1926, early 1927, when the Laverys were in the United States, O'Higgins wrote the following: I am lost and desolate without you. I want you, all the enchantments, sight and sounds, and the touch of you, as well as you are my life and my breath, my sun and air and wind. Although this style of writing must also be viewed in the context of the 1920s and from similar correspondence that Lady Lavery received from others. It should also be noted that out of 300 letters, only 30 have survived, leaving us with only about 10% of their messages to each other, which could have either strengthened or weakened these allegations. That being said, the evidence points to something beyond a simple friendship, and Una O'Higgins O'Malley, his daughter, admitted that her, quote, young and overstressed father had indeed been enamoured by the lovely Lady Lavery, and that these letters were, quote, indisputable. Actions such as this would have been interpreted as, quote, an understandable failure for a young man drawn from the innocent social circles of middle and upper class Catholic Ireland of the early 20th century into the vortex of London high society in the 1920s, in the words of John P. McCarthy. It should also be noted that O'Higgins was a complicated man who had suffered many personal tragedies in the early 1920s. His father had been murdered in January 1923. His first child was born in government buildings for safety owing to the Irish Civil War, the death of another son in November 1924, a few weeks after his birth, and perhaps most plaguing and controversial, the signing of the execution order for Rory O'Connor, who had been best man to O'Higgins at his wedding in 1921. Such calamities would undoubtedly have left O'Higgins a broken man, conflicting his personal judgment, and could have led him to unorthodox behaviour that would have been outside the norm of 1920s Ireland. McCarthy has further suggested in his biography of Kevin O'Higgins that while the letters are undeniable evidence of a romantic attachment, O'Higgins' actions perhaps did not veer to the physical, and that they should be interpreted as, quote, almost medieval chivalry on his part. As such, we can't say for certain what the exact nature of Lavery's and O'Higgins' relationship was, but what is certain is that such a correspondent on the part of the latter highlights an intimate private persona that contradicted with how he presented himself publicly as a deeply pious and moral Catholic. On the 10th of July 1927, while walking to attend Mass in Booterstown in Dublin, O'Higgins, without his personal bodyguard, was shot dead by 3 IRA members owing to his hardline stance during the Irish Civil War in ordering the execution of Republican prisoners. Similar to Collins's death, Hazel was devastated. In a letter from Shane Leslie, a friend of hers, she was, quote, aghast. She cried out that every man who ever loved her with true love was bound to die. She said she had killed her first husband, Collins and Kevin. She cursed herself as a curse to men, end quote. She did not attend his funeral, while a letter from O'Higgins's widow, Birdie, reveals a bitter undercurrent, a possible awareness of the letters exchanged between them. Quote, his own death was an inspiration. Quiet, great, beautiful, with 7 exclamation marks. Sometime I want to tell you about it, another exclamation mark. I'm sorry you were not here to say adieu to his noble spirit, for nothing in his life became him like the manner of leaving it, end quote. Owing to this bitterness, along with the political party Fianna Fáil taking up their seats at the Irish Parliament in 1927, a party that Hazel blamed for O'Higgins's death, as the political wing for those opposed to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, Lady Lavery felt a degree of ostracisation from Ireland. She was no longer the celebrated figure she once was in Irish nationalist circles, but in spite of this rejection, there would be one more brushstroke made in the canvas of Hazel's life that would help secure her reputation in Ireland, something that would be her most enduring and visual legacy. When the Irish Free State was created in 1922, it needed to adopt a new currency to replace the one that was inherited from the British. By 1927, a currency commission had been established to create the new banknotes, with the director of the National Gallery of Ireland, Thomas Bodkin, asked to advise the commission on their design. Bodkin, owing to his connections with the Laverys in terms of art, suggested in December 1927 that the image of Hazel Lavery be used as the principal picture on these banknotes. after some discussions about Hazel's suitability, it was agreed that the image be used in this currency. A painting was commissioned to be used on the banknotes called Portrait of Lady Lavery as Kathleen Houlihan, the female personification of Ireland, which was painted by her husband. While the identity of the model wasn't officially acknowledged, it was apparent to all who she was, not least because she had, quote, leaked the news herself, creating an awkward situation of an American with a British title becoming the face of Ireland through its banknotes. Nonetheless, the decision was made, and her image would feature on Irish pound notes from 1928 to the 1970s, and as a watermark on later banknotes until Ireland adopted the euro in 2002. On a personal note, the image is a very special one for me. Given that my main job is as an English teacher, teaching students who come to Ireland not just to learn this language, but also to experience Irish culture. Unfortunately, in Ireland, there has been a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric recently by people on the political fringes, but enough to worry people who come here to learn, but also to make a valued contribution to Irish society. In light of this, I view this image as a symbol of how people who come to Ireland can not only become Irish and feel welcome, but also can become symbols of the nation, furthering the sense of this island as the land of 100,000 welcomes. Céad Míle Fáilte. Indeed, W.T. Cosgrave, the head of government of the Irish Free State, essentially a PM, or Taoiseach as we would say in Ireland, from 1922 to 1932, would say of the banknotes, quote, "Every Irishman, not to mention the foreigner who visits Ireland, will carry one next to his heart." For the final years of Hazel's life, the couple continued to reside in the UK, the death of O'Higgins having created a sense of distance between Hazel and Ireland in spite of the new Irish banknotes. By the early 1930s, Hazel had contracted myocarditis, and over the next few years her health steadily declined, until on the 3rd of January 1935, Lady Hazel Lavery passed away in her sleep. Sir John Lavery wouldn't marry after Hazel's death, and he himself would pass away a few years later in 1941. Her funeral took place on the 7th of January 1937 at Brompton Oratory, with a memorial service taking place at Westland Row in Dublin, an acknowledgement of her legacy in Ireland in spite of her distance from the country in her final years. Lady Lavery's life consisted of only 54 years, but in that time she achieved more than many women of her day, indeed many men too. Apart from her image on Irish banknotes, of which only older generations would be familiar with, her story is largely forgotten, as is her lasting contribution to Irish independence, especially the Anglo-Irish Treaty Negotiations of 1921. Yet, as we have seen, there is more to the Chicago-born socialite who adopted Ireland as her spiritual home, from her personality to her connections, artistic talent, but also crucially the relationship with her husband, Sir John Lavery, who was greatly inspired by Hazel in terms of his own art. Indeed, I believe that it is only right that he should have the last say for this episode, as someone who knew her better than anyone else. In his autobiography, The Life of a Painter, published in 1940, the year before his death, John wrote the following about Hazel, quote, "These people did not come to see me. They came to see Hazel. She loved making friends. She had the gift and the power to use it, delighted in her always. She enjoyed all sorts and conditions of people, and she was almost childishly anxious to win each and every one's esteem and affection. She was genuinely interested in all she met, old or young, celebrities or nobodies. To her they were somebodies because they were human beings, and all humanity enthralled her. She was in love with the spectacle of life. When illness took her hand, from the pulse of the lives of others, she died. My life was my work, painting. Her life was life itself. That's all for today. Episode 6 will be a change in pace, in that I will be releasing a short episode in the middle of October. I will be on holidays in Greece and Turkey, and hope to record an episode from Istanbul on the Turkish writer Sabahattin Ali, followed by a longer official episode in early November, slightly later than the usual, hence the shorter episode in the meantime. The longer, more typical episode will be on the American artist John Sargent and his connections with important figures of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, including with Oscar Wilde. There will be a lot to discover here, so please stay tuned, follow the podcast on Spotify, or on our Facebook and Instagram links provided. And until next time, keep her lit.